Hi. The first thing I just wanted to say was just thanks to Emma Owen for inviting me here. It's really a great opportunity to speak to this audience. And as Emma pointed out, I've been given the remit to talk about militarism in context, the policy framework. But I have a couple of caveats to that. First of all, my academic work, my approach to militarization is a much broader one, that I've really been interested in looking at the long-term dynamics of militarism over time, going back to the late 19th century. And that gives a slightly different perspective and something slightly different that I would want to set the context for some of the things that we're talking about today. And it's something slightly different than looking at individuals and communities, but I think it's a really important context to understand all of these things within. The second caveat, which is a slightly more embarrassing one, is that I'm not an expert on UK defense policy or militarism. My empirical work's on the United States. But in the past couple of weeks, I've tried to become as much of an expert as I could be on some of the core documents and policies. It's actually been really fascinating, not only to see the kinds of things that have been going on that I've known about in principle from just for keeping up to date, but the kind of things like the Armed Forces Covenant, which is so important to many of the things that we're talking about today, but also things like the 2010 National Security Strategy, the related documents around Trident, revisioning the Army. These sorts of things are all really important. But the thing that's really struck me is how similar they are to things that are going on in the United States on a much smaller scale. And so I think I do have lots of things that I can say about this. But what I wanted to do was to actually talk about three key tendencies that we need to understand militarization within, and I'll try and refer to some of the British policy context within that, but also to some related things in the US that I think are worth mentioning as well. And basically, in that, I want to look at 5 things, and in 10 minutes, I'm not going to get enough time to talk about any of them. So this is going to be very brief and schematic, and hopefully if anyone has any questions, we can ask about them later. And it's not exhaustive either. But the 5 key historical tendencies that I want to talk about are these: nationalism, political economy, liberalism, global militarism, and also actual wars, which I think is something that's kind of important to talk about in the context of militarism. And some of these things are going to be common sense that you already know, but I think it's important to see them all together in some ways, that there are tendencies that intersect. They give rise to the context of very particular militarisms as well. And this is one of the core things that I've been trying to develop in my academic work, is to see that militarism is something that changes over time. It's something that's different in different national and local contexts. And it's also very much something that's situated in a global context as well. That these national militarisms that we see are often the consequence of all sorts of global pressures as well. So I'm going to very quickly try and say something about each of these categories and come to some sort of conclusion. The first one on nationalism is a fairly obvious one, that there's been a long-term connection between militarism and the national experience. I mean, this is the very context that we see the term militarism come out in the late 19th century. And this is one of the things that I think is so prominent in how we look at nationalism today. I mean, you only need to look at this Armed Forces Covenant to see that it very much comes out of this kind of context. Ideas about the connection between citizenship and service, the idea of the military as a protector of the society and the state, all of these sorts of things that give rise to very complex and deeply felt feelings, and ones that are very hard to dislodge. And it makes the discussion of militarism run up into all sorts of problems. I mean, politically, it means a real difficulty that I think everyone would know about being critical of the military in any kind of way, because it's seen as being unpatriotic, against the national interest, all sorts of things like this. And that's a very difficult one. I mean, the relationship to the US is just, imagine that, times 20. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. I mean, partially because it's so constricted in something that's such a long-term historical tendency as well. But I think analytically there's also an important point that of course, the day-to-day that we're looking at things that are specific to the UK, but I think that the study of nationalism becomes too focused on national experience as well, and also solutions at that level. And we do need to think more about how these fit into a global context, which is something I'll come back to. The second thing, which has already been briefly mentioned, about the political economy of militarism that's really important. I don't need to talk in too much detail about this, about ways in which arms industries fit in within that, especially in terms of arms trade, defense procurement, and the global links that we have with that, the kinds of contradictory aims that come out of this system, even if we think about it just in very rational terms about profits over security, these kinds of things, but also perceived interest in national economic policy, which has been a long-term thing to talk about arms industries in kind of developmental terms, despite any research that's shown that to be maybe fallacious in many ways. So this is another really important historical tendency. That's another thing that's very hard to dislodge in many ways and intersects with these other areas. But I'm just going to skim past that one because I think it's one that we all know fairly well. The third one, I think, is a really important one for understanding the UK context, which is that of thinking about how liberalism interacts with militarism. And I think this gives rise to a very specific context for thinking about what militarism looks like in the UK and in the US as well, but also about how this is affecting trends in militarism, militarization more globally. And this one I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on because I think it's worth dissecting some of these tendencies. And I think about 4 or so to talk about really quickly. The first one is in terms of the importance of professionalization in military forces within that context. That liberalism is very much against conscription, and which leads to a very particular idea of what the military is like in society. So a focus on professionalization of forces, which is something that happened in the 1960s, 1970s in both the US and the UK. The US very specifically put in the context of liberalism that the commission that was dealing with these issues in 1960, headed up by Milton Friedman, was very much against conscription as the idea that conscription is a form of taxation. And so this is a very important tendency within a liberal form of militarism. And the reason why this is important is partially to see what kinds of forces exist within that. But it's also the flip side, which is my second point, which is that there tends to be a focus much more on technological solutions, on capital-intensive approaches to warfare, things like nuclear weapons, air power, as a kind of solution to the so-called problem of manpower. Very deliberately using that phrase in that context as well. So there's kind of a dual tendency with that that's really important. But a third one is in terms of the kinds of interventions into society that liberal states had in thinking about militarism. I mean, the obvious one in terms of this capital technology issue is about directing production and technology towards sort of military things or related industries. But now also things that we see in say, the national security strategy about policies of resilience to populations as well. That there's this kind of insidious side to thinking about militarism beyond just military forces. And this is something that has been very common to that. And you only need to think about the politics of the Cold War, that often geopolitical enemies are actually internalized in some way. So anti-communism and the idea of some sort of fifth column within states. And now we have a very different kind of version of that that's much more related to ideas about terrorism, these sorts of things. So there's these profound interventions into society in shaping ideas about what militarism could be. The fourth thing is, in liberal states, a real denial of militarism, though, that militarism is something that other states do. And I think this is a really important tendency that goes way back again to 19th century ideas that liberalism and industrialization would be a solution to the problem of war. I mean, we can't forget that there was a real tendency in political thought, social thought about this, people like Herbert Spencer, especially in the British context, looking at this. And so we see, I think, a real denial of that. And I think the focus on defense, security, I mean, very obviously trying to get away from the idea that these are things that are about war and militarism. And finally, and this is something that the military historian Michael Howard had noted years ago, that the connection between liberalism and militarism, especially war, leads to a really campaigning idea of what militarism can be, especially when thinking about it abroad. That when liberal states go to war, it tends to be for some supposed higher ideal, whether it be human rights or some sort of a broader principle. I mean, Howard's comment on this is that it made it somewhat more dangerous in some ways, but I think we need to think of this point as being quite important on that in terms of the kinds of justifications for militarism or defense or security or whatever we want to call it in that context. Okay, point 4, global militarism. I think the global context of thinking about these local problems is really important, though. And there's two ways that I would want to read it. There's probably different ways we might look at this. The first is in terms of a system of geopolitics. And the way that this is usually talked about is that the international is a realm of necessity. So state leaders always have to react to the fact that there's threats and unpredictability. But my reading of this is slightly different, is that this necessity is a kind of social construct, that leaders do have to react to it in a way, but it's something that changes over time. And it has a real pressure on elites, leaders who deal with geopolitics to want to keep repeating these ideas about necessity. And we can see them all the time, though. This recent report on alternatives to Trident that basically say there are no alternatives to Trident very much draws on these ideas, that you need to keep a deterrent because there's always going to be, there always might be something threatening. And I think what this does is obviously it maintains that militarization is crucial for protecting society in some way, but it's also something that has helped maintain the geopolitical realm as a kind of private elite realm and somewhere that isn't susceptible to democratization like other realms of politics. And this has been a long-term thread of militarism from, again, the 19th century, changing context, but a very similar kind of thing. But it seems now that the geopolitical, and this is very much in the documents that I've looked at, in the national security strategy especially, that the geopolitical is now no longer about states and balancing other powers and things like this. It's about threats of openness. So it's about globalization and insecurity. And the question here is, why does this require a military response? Like, in the national security strategy, there's this admission that the UK isn't threatened by any other states in the world, but you still have to find some sort of excuse to do all these other things. But the second part, and I'll say this really quickly, is there's also a sort of transmission of ideas globally that's really important. And this is what I would consider a global militarism, the idea globally what states think is threatening, an idea of best practice in terms of what militarism is and what preparedness means. And I think these are all sorts of important pressures that go into what governments are trying to do in preparing policy. And the final thing, and then I'll conclude, is this idea about war as well. And I think this is a really important and difficult thing to get a hold of, is that militarism itself and what it is often transformed through actual wars. We see these dynamics all the time. And for example, the aftermath of the Second World War, hugely destructive conflict, very much changed ideas about what preparedness should look like, what the ideas of what war could look like. And I think recent experiences of war, and we can see this in all the documentation and policy is based around the experiences of Afghanistan and Iraq, that this is something that might change, it might reinforce, it might provide opportunities to do something slightly different. And so my concluding thing is that, just 2 quick points and I'll end. First of all, that militarism really is a shifting set of ideas and institutions, which we do need to keep in mind. And I think it's much better to talk of militarisms of various sorts. And the kind of thing that we look at as militarism today isn't necessarily the exact same thing as it was 100 years ago. And it's not necessarily the exact same thing that's happening somewhere else. And I think it's important to keep that in context. And also to say that these 5 things that I pointed out aren't the only things, and we've already seen in the previous presentation some other things are really important. And I think the most important thing that I've left out, to not even make my portrait more complicated, is all these normal kinds of social stratification that I've left out around gender, class, and race as well, which I think are hugely important in understanding these issues. So I'll leave it at that. Sorry I went over slightly.